and welcome to Week 8 lecture, Soft Proofing and Printing Workflow. My name is Amber Deniger. So far this semester, you've learnt more about the physical qualities of light. You've been practicing to capture it in raw format and complete input processing to create a digital master file, finally saving it to DNG. In the previous lecture, I covered some of the fundamental concepts around selecting the correct pixel-based file format and color space in order to output from that digital master file. Remember, the raw file or DNG file contains raw data from the camera's sensor. Even when you've completed input processing, until you actually save it to a JPEG, a TIFF or a PSD, it's still raw data. In this week's lecture, I'd like to introduce you to the concepts around soft proofing and printing, specifically using the Epson 3880. However, this theory also applies to any professional quality printer. So you'll be printing from a TIFF, that's a pixel-based 16-bit file, and we'll also look at options for output sharpening and selection of ink and paper. In the past, I've introduced you to ICC Profiles, but as a refresh, let's go over them again quickly, as use of ICC Profiles at this stage of the workflow is essential. They are your quality assurance when used correctly. So ICC Profiles are a set of data that describe how color is managed with any type of digital imaging device, such as a camera, scanner, monitor or printer. ICC, or the International Color Consortium, was formed in 1993 and it was it's a way to create vendor neutral color management systems for all operating systems and associated software. So as our imaging workflow or our imaging capture and workflow became more digitized, they recognized that there was a need to have some type of color management system applied to this. So each device has a unique color profile, and some manufacturers provide those color profiles. You can, through calibration, create a customized color profile. So that applies once again to your camera, your scanner. You can even customize a color profile for projectors. Anything can be profiled. So looking at this slide, you can see a diagram of how color may be managed between capture, working spaces and output. It's done through that application of profiles or ICC profiles. For the most of the time you don't even realize this is happening. However, when the image comes into the computer for input processing and output preparation, you will need to be consciously working with profiles and to be selecting the correct working space and output profile. So a display profile is the result of the calibration of your computer monitor or display. It's a way of ensuring that what you see on your screen is true color, or color as it should be. A working space profile is a color space standardized across digital imaging profiles, such as digital imaging software, such as Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Lightroom. These are known as color space profiles, and you would be familiar with these because we've looked at them in class. They're Adobe RGB 1998, sRGB, ProPhoto RGB and CMYK. So remember that a digitized colored image is captured in RGB red, green and blue. Computer monitors display RGB values on screen, and all transmitted light devices operate in additive RGB color spaces. Display gamut refers to the amount or range of colors that may be represented by your monitor or display. Output gamut refers to the range of colors that may be replicated via the output device. In the case of a printed image, what can be replicated on ink or paper surface is different to what we see with our eye and is different to what the monitor can display. So different quality monitors will be able to display a different range of color and tone. So thinking about your RGB color capture is Color pixels are represented by red, green and blue, or their opposites, cyan, magenta and yellow. An RGB image is made up of 3 grayscale images, red, green and blue channels, and this then sets the tonal range behind your image. Monitors display images that use red, green and blue phosphors or LEDs. Color profiles assist output devices to produce color and to produce correct color, and provides correct color information to the device, and also allows you to soft proof. When you think about your display or your monitor, all devices produce different RGB values. So the color numbers associated with those red, green and blue colors as viewed on screen may be displayed differently via the color number, depending on the device that you're using or the monitor that you're using. But don't be too concerned about that. If you calibrate your device, then you'll know that what you're seeing is true color. So color profiles defined how color is rendered, and color profiles assist display devices to produce that true color. And no, as I said, you can, through calibration, create a customized color profile. Numbering systems actually specify color appearance, and this allows the profile to tell the color management systems exactly what colors a given set of RGB numbers represent. So when you think about RGB colors for output, it's those color profiles once again that assist the output devices to understand what color you're wanting to print. So they assist output devices to produce correct color, and it provides the color information for the device. So it produces color numbers which are interpreted by the device to represent true color. Biggest advantage to using profiles is that it allows you to soft proof before you go to print. So this allows you to visualize what the final image is going to, how it's going to appear before you go to print. And of course, at the end of the day, that means less wastage of ink and paper. When you actually go to print, it's a CMYK color printing method. So the inks in the Epson printer are range of magenta, yellows, cyan and blacks. Okay, and these color inks combine to make red, green, blue, cyan, yellow and black images. It's a subtractive color process, but we're not printing to CMYK, so we're not working in a CMYK color space to print to a printer. It's because instead of being visible light, we're not working with visible light, we're working with inks on paper. It's a different process. So you will work with RGB color spaces all the way through your print process, even though the inks themselves are delivered at CMYK, they're CMYK ink sets. Okay, so as an overview, ICC profiles, why are they so important? You can, through calibration, create that customized color profile for your monitor. That means what you're seeing, you can be assured, is true color. It's a set of numbers that replicate true color as you've captured it and as you have processed and what you see on your screen. It's actually the numbering systems in behind, what we see on the screen, that specify actual color appearance. And it's these profiles that tell the color management systems exactly which colors a given set of RGB numbers should represent. So what do I mean by this? So let's have a look at this color managed workflow. This is just a small example. So my input color is this blue, and it's made up of 64 units of red, 128 units of green and 192 units of blue. When it's displayed on the monitor, this is what we're going to get. 18 units of red, 127 green and 202 of blue. So even though the input numbers are this, between the monitor and the print device, it has to give it another set of numbers to replicate that same colour on the monitor. When it goes to print, there's its colour numbers, and if we were going to pre-press, there's another set of numbers. So instead of you having to work this all out, it's through the use of profiles that talk to each other between devices, which will ensure that your colour that you input and view on your device will also be your output colour. So you have taken your photograph, you've put it onto your computer screen, you've processed it, you've saved it as a TIFF finally. There's one important thing that you have to do before you're ready to go to print, and this is aside from any other creative work with applying textures, borders, whatever else you're going to do. You have to think about output sharpening. So even though you have sharpened in your input processing, all images require different levels of customized output sharpening. There are 3 types of sharpening workflows I suggest that you use, and the selection of the correct sharpening for your image depends on the type of image that you have. Over sharpening is much more noticeable than under sharpening, so no, if in doubt, just pull it back a little bit. But before you actually apply sharpening, and this is one of the last things that you'll do before you actually go to print, check for any image faults. So I look at my image carefully at 100% and make sure that the crop is right. But remember, we're cropping in Adobe Camera Raw onto raw data instead of pixel-based image. And ensure that the image is the correct size and resolution for printing. So if you're going to print at an A3 size, ensure that your image is close to or is an A3 size file, and that the resolution, that's the amount of pixels per square inch in the image, are correct for the type of printer that you're printing to. So let's think about what type of output sharpenings we can use. My go-to for years has been the Unsharp mask. Well, Unsharp mask, is not as it would seem. It applies sharpening to unsharp images. So what sharpening does is increases the contrast between the light and dark pixels. So the light side of the pixel is lightened and the dark side of the pixel is darkened. But with Unsharp mask, it cannot differentiate between image edges and noise. So any of the sharpening software looks for the edge of the image to find that intersect between light and dark to apply that contrast, that element of contrast. When we think of sharpening, it's exactly the same as what we did in input processing. It is the amount, so that's the strength or the amount of sharpening applied, the radius, how far from the edge or the pixel will there be an increase in the contrast, and threshold is the number of individual tone levels where the process should be applied. So I've provided you here a few presets which will help you. So if nothing else, if sharpening becomes a little bit too much for you, just go to a preset and you'll be fine. I've left you a link here to Adobe. So on the Adobe site there's some lovely tutorials about sharpening as well. So let's have a look at the application of Unsharp mask. So amount 1, radius 0.1, threshold 0. So I've gone to the least amount that I can. Can you see that there's just a very fine white line running down next to the black, the intersect between the black and the grey? Let's have a look at this one. So at 250% and radius of 4 pixels, but still no threshold is 0 levels. Can you see now how that lightening of the light side, the mid-grey, and you can't actually see the black on the black here, but you can see the lightening on this side. So this is my favourite recipe for Unsharp mask. It provides a really natural sharpening to anything that I choose to sharpen, but do be careful. Unsharp mask, remember, can't discriminate between noise and edges of the image. So if you've got a really noisy image, best not use Unsharp mask. Smart Sharpen is the other sharpening tool that I would suggest that you use. It's really good for targeted sharpening, and it also reduces the addition of sharpening to the noise in the shadows or the darker areas. So Smart Sharpening, as it suggests, is a more complex, but it's a much finer tool to be using for sharpening. So Smart Sharpen detects edges, so it produces fewer halos around, especially noise. And you can choose to sharpen for Gaussian blur, lens blur, or motion blur. Whereas Unsharp Mask only sharpens or corrects Gaussian blur. Once again, I've given you a little video tutorial on the use of Smart Sharpen. It's quite complex. It would be number 3 probably on the list of complexity here. High pass sharpening. So this is a really good sharpening tool, especially if you do have that noise in your images, because you can really finesse the application or the amount of sharpening. So it finds the edges for sharpening, and it's a little bit more complex than Unsharp Mask, not as complex as Smart Sharpen, but it has a really good outcome and a high level of accuracy. So I find high pass sharpening, to my eye, sometimes can over sharpen, and so that's why I prefer my old recipe with Unsharp Mask. But if used carefully, it does provide a great outcome. Think about sharpening for your output media. Matte paper requires more sharpening than gloss. Sharpening is also resolution dependent. So no, some of these types of sharpening processes are better on small resolution images or smaller image than larger ones. Choose the type of output sharpening. No, so just don't continually use the one type. Explore all those 3 systems. You can always customize sharpening process through use of layer mask. So even though you apply sharpening, if you also add a layer mask, then you can remove sharpening from certain areas of your image, which is really a great way to work with sharpening, because as you know, your eye is drawn to higher contrast or more much sharper areas in an image. So you can work with this in a very smart manner by sharpening some areas and leaving others soft, so that the most important element in your image you should apply your sharpening to and reduce the sharpening to other parts of the image. You can also think about this if you have an image that is overall a bit soft. If you sharpen and then reduce the sharpening to other areas around, once again, the important part of your image, it may appear sharper. But try and get your image in focus is probably the best advice I can give you here. So I've got some examples here of not sharpened and sharpened images. So in this left hand side you can see, let's concentrate on just this front leaf here and this one here. Okay, so in the left hand side image there's been no sharpening applied at all, and if there was nothing to compare it to you would probably think that it looked fine. But here on the right hand side image I have used high pass to sharpen this image, and can you see now how there's these beautiful highlight detail is jumping out in the image, because that's the high pass sharpening software has found those image edges and increased the contrast around the edges of the file. So once again, this is an infrared image, so the left hand one is not sharpened, the right hand one is sharpened. This is using Unsharp Mask, and can you see how there it appears, because this is black on white, can you see there's an illusion of more contrast in the image? So the blacks or the dark area of the roofline here becomes darker, and even in the trees as well. So it's that illusion of higher contrast provides also that illusion of sharpness as well. I want you to explore sharpening a little bit. So you're going to have to put some time into looking at sharpening. But let's get back to soft proofing as a workflow. So remember, soft proofing is used as a way to emulate how the print is going to look with your paper and printer combination. So it's a way for you to preview what your final print is going to look like, but on screen. So how are you going to do this? The first thing that I would say to you is to duplicate your file before you start the process, and that way you have a reference and a working file. Without the working file, then you have nothing to go by. In this slide here, what I want you to see is on the left hand side is it's the same image, but what I've done is I've applied the print profile for premium glossy paper. On the right hand side is archival matte paper. So this is where you can preview your file, see which is the best paper even for your print. As you can see in the right hand side image, there is a lack of contrast, so the whole image, look at this here, has the contrast has been lowered. Whereas with the glossy paper, because it's a really high contrast image, it appears that it'll print better on the glossy paper. So once again, soft proofing gives you an opportunity to adjust the image for the difference between the image on a backlit screen and an image reproduced on paper. It allows you to select your paper before you go to print. It is a simulation, or it simulates paper, colour and ink on paper. So what are you going to do? How are you going to go about starting this? So once you have your image duplicated, then you're going to apply a profile to one of those images. And you do this in Adobe Photoshop through View, Proof Setup, and you're going to select Custom. Once you've selected that custom profile here, so you'll go into that drop down list as you do here, and you'll find that custom. There's my printer and there's my paper, and ensure that you select simulate paper color, because I'm going to tell you soon about selecting your paper. So select your paper color and simulate black ink, really important. And then what you have is a simulation of what that print's going to look like on your selection of paper, printer and with black ink. Remember, sometimes what you see on the screen may not be reproducible as a printed image. So this is another reason why you should always soft proof, because different paper stocks also have different gamuts or different print ranges, and your image, if you've got vibrant colour, may be they may be out of gamut or beyond what's reproducible on that paper, and we can fix that to a certain extent by using different rendering intents when we go to print. So soft proofing is an on-screen simulation of the printed image on a calibrated screen. That's quite important. Always remember to check the image gamut warning in Adobe Photoshop. So here it is, View, Gamut Warning, and out of gamut color, even before you go to print or apply a print profile, you'll see they'll come up as these grey areas of greyed out color. Out of gamut means that either the monitor or the paper profile is not able to understand what color you want to reproduce, so it won't reproduce the correct color. So soft proofing workflow steps: duplicate your file, number 1, and in Adobe Photoshop View, Proof Setup, select Custom, and you're going to choose the printer and paper profile for the appropriate printer. So if you're using the 48800 in Townsville or 3800s in Cairns, always use black point compensation, select paper, emulate the paper color, and if you have no outer gamut color, then you can use relative colorimetric intent. If you are having gamut colors, outer gamut colors, then we'll be using perceptual intent to bring them into gamut. They're just two ways of dealing with the color numbers on screen through to paper to output. Let's have a quick look at rendering intents. So relative colorimetric intent compares a color space, with the destination color space and aligns the colors accordingly. Any out of gamut color is shifted to the nearest reproducible in gamut color in the destination space. So if you have, here we are over here, if you have vastly out of gamut colors, this is what happens because the rendering intent, or the rendering, the engine, the software that is going to give instructions to the printer may give the wrong instructions. Just be careful. It may clip your out of gamut color, so that means that it will not reproduce that color at all, or it may assign an incorrect color. So any out of gamut color is shifted to the nearest reproducible in gamut color in the destination space. If you have out of gamut color, so when you've applied your print profile and it's coming up as out of gamut colors, then you'd go to perceptual rendering intent. So what it does is it actually it provides the printer with a different set of data, and it attempts to create the same color through a different set of color numbers. So perceptual is a way of attempting to print out of gamut colors. Now sometimes it might be just a change of paper stock will make a difference between in and out of gamut color with your printing. Which leads me to the next topic: selecting ink and paper. So when thinking about print mediums, the type of surface finish that's available for paper, from gloss to matte, the weight of the paper, the colour of the paper base, are all variants you should consider. There is such a variety of paper surface finishes, and these range from smooth through to quite textured. Also the paper ranges from gloss through to matte. The selection of paper and the type of paper depends entirely on your image and how you'd like that final image to appear. Now also, paper has different colour of the base. So some papers, and especially if you think about the Epson gloss and semi-gloss, they're quite a cool colour base in the paper. Whereas the Canson papers, especially my favourite, which is here, has a beautiful warm paper base. Okay. Some papers have artificial brightness in them as well, and this will also affect how your image appears. As a rule, think about images with deep vibrant colour and that are dependent on the rendering of high contrast tonal range from blacks through to whites are best printed on a paper ranging maybe the gloss and the lustres, because these papers have a larger gamut. They're able to reproduce this depth of tone and colour much more successfully. If you have muted tones, soft pastels, soft lighting, subtle colour, then matte paper will reproduce this image really quite successfully. Well, so will the gloss. But then it becomes a choice of an aesthetic choice. I print only on matte papers, but that suits my type of work as well. The old red brick buildings that I've been using in my lectures, I print that on a Canson paper, but it's a luster, it's a resin type of paper. So it's like a luster paper, it's somewhere between gloss and matte, because it doesn't print onto the matte paper successfully because those deep reds of the brickwork. So if you think about how ink is delivered and received by the paper stock, then there's a little little bit more added complexity about the decision of what paper to print on. As a new printer, as a person who's new to this, just stay with your gloss and semi-gloss papers. They're much cheaper and they will print nearly everything that you can throw at them because they have such a wide gamut. So gloss and semi-gloss paper have a paper base, okay, and an inkjet receiving layer. They're really quite a simple paper. The ink is delivered to the paper through the print head, and it sinks into the ink receiving layer and just sits just underneath the paper. This looks quite a bit of depth, but I can tell you now it just sits underneath that gloss level there. So the reflectance value of the paper provides this illusion of sharpness and saturation, and this ink just does sit under that top layer. But gloss you have to be a little bit more careful of because it is prone to print errors such as bronzing and gloss differential. So I'll tell you about that in a minute. So the resin coated papers is the other one that I work with, and I only work with this when I have strong colour or a large tonal range including deep blacks in my images. And the ink once again is dispersed into that receiving layer, but there is, as you can see, quite a number of layers sitting underneath it. So the resin coated paper is a professional grade of paper, and the ink does sit, so it's visible just on top of the receiving layer as well as saturated into the receiving layer. The resin coated papers replicate traditional photographic papers, so darkroom papers. My favourite paper, matte paper. The ink is dispersed into the receiving layer and bonds with the paper pulp underneath. Here we are. So paper pulp, receiving layer, inkjet receiving layer, and there's our ink there. It sits right in underneath the surface. The light has to penetrate the paper surface to the ink. So remember, the way we see colour or we see an image is that light bounces off from that colour or that object. So this is why it's quite different. Each of these papers has quite a different look, or we see them see the image quite differently on each of them. So matte surface reflects off light diffusely, while glossy surface produces specular reflections. The more glossy, the more specular and less diffuse reflection. It is possible to have matte and glossy paper that, when printed with black ink, have the same level of absorption and reflectance of light, but usually the black on the glossy paper will look darker than the black on the matte paper because of the way the light reflects on the surfaces. So let's say that black printed on both papers absorbs about 90% of the light and reflects about 10%. On the matte paper we will have 10% of the diffuse reflection, and on glossy paper 8% specular and 2% diffuse. So if you put both papers on a wall and at eye level, the light coming from the ceiling will likely hit the paper from an angle about 30 to 45%. The diffuse reflection on the matte paper will send some of the reflected light towards your eyes, let's say half of it. So the black area of the matte paper sends about 5% of the light back towards your eye. On the glossy paper, the specular reflection will bounce at the same angle towards the floor, not hitting your eye, so you'll only see half of the diffuse reflection, 1%. So that makes the black on the glossy paper look much darker than the black on the matte paper, even if both reflects the same amount of light. You'll only see specular reflection on the glossy paper if you have light source at the opposite angle to your eyes. Then you see glare. So think about how light reflects off these papers or not, okay, and how you'll interact with them. I would suggest to you that you try printing on different paper stock once you have perfected your soft proofing to print on a cheaper paper. So bronzing. Now I did say to you that gloss paper has some problems, and mostly around bronzing and gloss differential. Bronzing's when the paper or the image is viewed from an angle and part of the image seems to disappear or appear as a green bronze tone. Now this is where there's been too much ink laid down, and this is a problem with gloss paper. Gloss differential is visible on a glossy surface when there is a difference between the amount of ink applied to the paper's surface, and it's especially noticeable with areas where the printers where highlight and colour dark or darker line. So if you think about there's no white ink in the printers, okay? There's CMYK. So how do we get light colours or white? Is that there's actually no ink laid down on that part of the image. So when you have that intersect between light and dark or bright colours, then what you'll see is an absence of ink on the paper. So that's gloss differential. Now this also becomes a problem, when you think about theoretically about the colour, the base of your paper as well. So if you're working with a cool coloured paper and all of a sudden you have an absence of colour, okay, and what happens with cool colours? They recede. So what happens is that you will visually, there'll not only be a gap in the colour, but also that part of the image will recede from view as well. So this also is the same when you have warm coloured papers. So when there's no ink on the paper, that area of the image will appear to move forward towards a viewer. So knowing that gloss differential is an error of printing in some ways, but if you have intersects between highlight and colour or tone, you can be really smart with that by choosing a different colour or paper stock colour. Okay. So lastly, just let's have a think about pigment and dye-based inks. The Epson printers use pigment inks. They're absolutely more stable. They're a single particle of pigment in solution. Pigment inks are absolutely more archival, and they always will be, and they're water resistant, so they won't smudge. So dye-based inks are soluble. They'll smudge. So if they get water spilt on them or they get damp, they will smudge. Both inks, though, are susceptible to environmental factors. So when you display your images, keep them away from direct sunlight, keep them away from fluorescent lighting, okay, because both of these will start to break down the ink. Pigment ink takes time to dry. About 24 hours your image will be dry, and at that point you can successfully view the image and see the final colour. Okay, it will shift slightly. So this is when you're getting really fussy and you really know what you're doing and looking at with your printing. And remember that ink-based ink, dye-based ink is never quite dry. So even weeks, months, years, if it comes into contact with water, it will become water soluble again. When you're thinking about the type of paper to use to print, always go to good quality archival paper. So the quality of the paper, whether it has an acid, neutral base, or it has optical brighteners in it. So papers, the quality and the difference. So the surface, the texture, the colour, the whiteness and the weight. No, I prefer matte, really heavy GSM papers. Quality of the ink. Always choose the best you can. So pigments, as I just said to you, are more stable and less susceptible to fade. They're water soluble, they're water safe, so they're not going to wash off the page. But when you're storing your archival prints, store them in boxes unless they're going to be framed. If you're going to frame them, then frame them behind a mat, preferably, so there's that just little bit of space between the print and the glass. Don't put them in direct sunlight, and they don't light, obviously, cigarette smoke and humidity. But also fluorescent lighting will start to break down your images eventually. If you select good quality paper and good quality pigment ink, then your digital prints have a lifespan of at least 100 years. So remember last lecture I said to you that traditional printing has a lifespan about 60 years. So inkjet printing has much longer lifespan than traditional printing processes. So as an overview of your soft-proofed print workflow, save your image to a pixel-based file from Adobe Camera Raw, apply sharpening, so from any of the suggested processes, duplicate the file so you have a reference and a working file. Apply the printer paper profile to the working file on campus, or if you're working as an external student, you'll need to download a paper profile from the supplier, and I've given you the Epson link there, and so you'll have to use this paper profile to soft-proof your image. You'll use adjustment layers to match the reference file with the working file. So that is that you'll be using adjustment layers on the working file to change the color and tone of the working image with the soft proof, the profile on, to make it appear the same as your reference image. Now I've given you a PDF to step through all this. If you are having troubles, you should contact your tutor. Lastly, know when you go to print, once again I've given you a PDF for this, but ensure that the color management is set to Adobe and not to the printer, because otherwise you've done all this careful preparation in vain, because what we've done is we've asked the working profile on our monitor and through a rendering intent engine to give the correct color numbers to Adobe Photoshop and to the printer, so that what we're going to do in our print is replicate what we're seeing on our screen. So I've given you quite a few resources here if you want to have a look. There's some tutorials on sharpening. Do practice your sharpening, and there's your Epson paper profiles, but also the Canson paper profiles. Okay, thank you and good luck.